Man, I love collecting action figures. But the two biggest problems are, well, one, running out of space. I have so many toys I wish I could display, like my entire Masters of the Universe Classics collection, which is unfortunately in boxes. And the other problem is they tend to fall over. Well, I mean, not all the time, but, one falls over and, well, they're basically like, oh, what's a good metaphor? I can't think of a metaphor. But the point is, yeah, one action figure falls over and then they all just, fall down like dominoes. And anyway, I'll come up with a good metaphor later. But there's nothing worse than coming home and finding all of your figures all over the floor because one figure happened to tip. And for decades, fans have been coming up with different solutions. Sometimes they're solutions that you can buy. There are companies that sell stands, and there are a lot of people on Etsy and other things coming up with creative solutions. At Matty Collector, there was a very deliberate attempt to cater to this aspect of the hobby because honestly, as a collector myself, I was so sick of my toys falling over. Flying stands were a early hit, but a lot of the Masters of the Universe Classic fans wanted something to call their own, something that really called out to the brand and would be a cool way to display the entire Masters of the Universe Classics collection. And this was, of course, years before we had Castle Greyskull, which was basically the ultimate display stand. So while the vintage toys never had official stands, and honestly, they didn't have that much trouble standing because of the way they were hunched over, the natural balance of, well, I guess the weight ratio helped keep them in place. But there's definitely been a lot of fan-created ways of, well, keeping these figures up, even though they didn't have pegs in their holes in their feet for pegs. Masters of the Universe Classics, though, we did anticipate this, and while we gave them a ton of articulation that ideally would keep them standing and not topple, we thought ahead and made sure that all the figures did have holes in their feet for potential pegs down the line. So, with fans wanting something to specifically keep Masters of the Universe Classic figures, well, it was time to sit down and ask ourselves,
Be part of the problem, or are you the solution?
So our first brand-specific stands, well, actually, maybe the Justice League ones were, but those were because, again, no holes or no pegs in the feet, and a solution was needed. But for Masters of the Universe fans, the first actually sculpted, tooled item were the Castle Greyskull stands. And again, this was years before we actually had a Castle Greyskull. We never knew if we'd be able to get to one, but hey, if you couldn't do a Castle Greyskull, at least do the floor plan, right? But we wanted to really make something that was going to stand out. It wasn't just going to be sort of a black circle or clear oval that figures plugged into. And for this, the Horsemen stepped up because these were sculpted by the Four Horsemen just like all of the action figures. And again, because thought was put in ahead of time to make sure all the figures could use pegs, holes in the feet from the day one helped ensure this. So the Castle Grayskull stand was essentially a square that was interchangeable and customizable. You see all those holes there in it that He-Man is showing off here. Well, all of those holes were intended for different pegs. And the set came with everything you would need to place the pegs for the feet holes in any one of those slots. You could also attach a backer or even sider, if you will, those little brick triangle pieces on the left side there could be attached to the base to create much more of a 3D effect. So you got both a floor and wall segments that, could look like it was part of a crumbling Castle Grayskull wall or, just added just enough. We also included a handy-dandy tool that was used for extracting the pegs so that you could move them around and place them in any of the holes. I remember Terry Higuchi was the designer on this, and again, the Horsemen were the sculptors, and they really went the extra mile. Most action figure stands are very plain. They're one color, and, this one looked cool in He-Man's hands as an accessory. If you wanted to, throw a chunk of Castle Grayskull at someone, well, now you had that. So, hey, stands, action play, it was everything you could hope for. But for some folks, putting all the characters on Castle Grayskull didn't feel quite right because, well, Castle Grayskull is, in a way, associated with the good guys, even though originally it was supposed to be for everybody. So, hey, we stepped up with the Snake Mountain stands. And again, years before there was actually a Snake Mountain playset that Super 7 put out. There we go. I don't need the with. You'll notice it has the same basic concept of the interchangeable peg holes, so the peg can go in any one of the holes you choose, as well as the 3D backing wall section, if you will, that little spike coming up, that could be placed next to or around the actual base. So, huge hit, just like the Greyskull stands, and this time themed for Snake Mountain. You got a little bit of a lava flow, a little bit of rocks, and, again, it made a great stand, and if you wanted to get enough for every single figure, you could put all your bad guys on Snake Mountain stands and your good guys on Greyskull stands. We never quite got to Horde and Snake Men, and I know a lot of people would have loved stands for every single faction. And, it does, I think, make displaying single figures look really cool. Especially if you're at your desk at work and you only have room for one figure, being able to put them on a 3D land element, if you will, not just a blank circle, is pretty cool. Our next attempt to help fans out with stands were the Greyskull stacking stands. So this was something that Bill Beneke and I had been talking about. We had a lot of drives up and down to Warner Brothers from El Segundo to Burbank, which is about an hour and a half each way. We would drive for our DC meetings with Warner Brothers, and during this time we would talk about all sorts of toy ideas. And one of the ones that we came up with, I'm not really doing good with the words today, we're doing stackable stands. Basically knowing that in order to maximize shelf space, fans wanted to sometimes prop up figures in the back so they would be on a taller level. Personally, I've used stands from a Container Store that for displaying, I think, spice racks they have. But this was cooler because this was a spice rack that looked like Castle Greyskull. And you could stack it and customize it based on how many you had. The more you had, the higher you could stack. So it was a great way of creating levels to display more figures in less space. Our final wall display system, was the wall display system. See, it's W words today. I seem to be really screwing up the W words. Walrus, Waldo, Wen, Will, Wilma, Whittle. All right, so the wall stands take advantage of the fact that a lot of fans like to display, especially packaged product, on their walls. And again, limited display space, as you lose shelf space, well, why not maximize the walls behind the figures or between shelves? Basically, you could have an action figure anywhere you wanted. The way they worked was a stand could be set in any one of three positions for 6-inch, 12-inch, or even minifigures, and then an interchangeable backer that was both yellow and a green one you could use for both DC Universe or Masters of the Universe Classics, or really anyone who looked cool in front of a green wall, because honestly, it's pretty generic. But yes, the green wall was meant for Masters of the Universe Classic figures, and you could display two 6.5-inch figures per stand if the floor pieces are assembled as shown, but there was a middle slot as well, so if you had smaller figures and wanted to do that, it was meant to really be a universal solution for finding more space to display your toys. Something that I knew myself as a collector, and Bill was also a collector. We both had this issue. And this was something we wanted to come up with, not necessarily specifically for MOTU Classics, although it was marketed that way, but as, again, toy fans ourselves, we needed something. And this was one of those cases where, well, let's make the product that we need. And we used Matty Collector as the avenue to have that happen. And I was really proud of this one because I thought it was very innovative, and it fit in a very small space. So if you were at work, you had a cubicle, or just a little extra space anywhere in your house or in your collection, you could now maximize that space by displaying more toys for more science high.